Thank you very much, Caitlin, and good evening to you all. Thank you, Napa County Historical Society, for having me here tonight to talk about Maria Juarez. Um, First off, I want to acknowledge that November is Native American Heritage Month. Therefore, it's very appropriate that we take a minute to acknowledge that we are gathered here within the ancestral territory of both the Wapo, right, and Yuki speaking people who live throughout the Sonoma and Napa valleys, and then, of course, Patwin, Southern Michigan, uh, lived throughout American Canyon, Sassoon Valley, and Napa Valley. So I just wanted to make sure that that acknowledgement was out there. The story I'll be covering tonight will touch somewhat on Patwin history of Southern Napa Valley. But I'm also going to talk a lot about histories connected with other tribal groups in the Monterey and San Francisco area. It's based on research that about 10 years of research. It's been kind of a journey for me. I did for a paper entitled Daughters of the Land. It's soon to be published in the November 2025, so it's just right in press now as we speak, edition of a journal called Bulletin. It's a journal of the California Missions Foundation. Now, if you're not familiar with that foundation, there are scholars there that are doing incredible work in the last 15 to 20 years, and I can't emphasize enough to maybe attend one of their conferences, become a member, because you might learn a little something more than what some of the traditional narratives are out there in some of the history books. Now, I argue in this paper that intermarriage during the California mission period served as a means of cultural agency and social advancement for a select group of California Indigenous women. If you can move on to the next slide. Here we go. And what I'm trying to do, what I was hopefully trying to do with this paper, is contribute to a body of historiographical literature that's been written in the last 10 years or so that frames the histories of women in Alta California through the lens of race, gender, and identity. Okay, and what we're doing is we're trying to challenge what I call challenging the Ramona complex. Right, and if you're familiar with that novel by Helen Hunt Jackson that was, quite popularized in the turn of the century about a half Native woman who fell in love with the rancho worker. But, unfortunately, it kind of created some myths and stereotypes that have kind of done harm to some of the images that we have of California and women over the time. Over time, the mixed blood offspring of Spanish Mexican soldiers and indigenous women from missions came to be known as Las Hijas del País, right? Daughters of the land. In a few cases, you might have seen them referred to as Mujeres del Mundo, right? Women of the world. And Maria Juarez was one of these women. Her life story and that of her Rumsen Ohlone mother and grandmother are but just one example of how complex and diverse the social fabric of Alta California was during the Spanish and Mexican period. It is because of the fluid nature of the Spanish casta system during those time periods that a woman's identity and social status in life did not solely depend on her ethnicity or racial casta from birth in the California frontier. We'll go ahead and move on to good. So rather than tell you all, what's all in my article, I'm hoping you're going to read that. I'd like to share with you, get a little more personal and share with you my own personal journey of how I came to learn about the Juarez family. And ironically, it didn't start here in Napa. It started in Sacramento. And it started with this basket. 12 to 13 years ago, I was working as a volunteer cleaning baskets that were then housed in the statewide museum collection center in West Sacramento. Now today, that ethnographic collection is housed at McClellan Park, the former McClellan Air Force Base. These baskets are part of, like I mentioned, that collection, and I was working under supervision of Native basket scholar, named Brian Bibby, who at the time was preparing an exhibit entitled Essential Art with a number of pieces from the collection. And he was also working on a catalog book, eventually published, and this is that book here. It's called Essential Art. I wrote a history on the California State Museum. That was my written contribution to that. But I helped clean some of the baskets that are featured in that collection. And among those baskets are 150 pieces that were donated to the state of California by Dolores Juarez Unger, one of the great granddaughters of Maria and Matthias Cayetano Juarez. Brian brought out 3 baskets from the Unger collection with stickers labeled Napa. One of which was this piece right here, a traditional Patlin Wintoon coiled basket form, they call it truncated comb. It wasn't actually used for cooking, it was meant to be a gift basket. And it had been collected by Cayetano and Maria while they were living at Rancho Tulacay, depending on who you ask the pronunciation, sometime between 1840 and 1860. He wrote later in the book Essential Art that both Maria's maternal grandmother and great-grandparents had been baptized at Mission Carmel and were of Ohlone ancestry. Now, I wasn't involved in that research, but once I saw that written in the book, that was very intriguing to me, right? And for me, it left some questions unanswered. Now, when I moved to Napa with my family in the summer of 2014, these baskets were still very fresh in my mind. And shortly afterwards, I acquired a position as a museum educator at the Napa Valley Museum. Next slide. It was during this time I read the book, This Land Was Mexican Once, Histories of Resistance of Northern California by Lyndon Heidenreich. It's a classic, by the way, if you haven't read it, on Napa history. Kind of revolutionized my way of thinking, quite honestly. I was trained as an ethnohistorian at Sac State, but I didn't have a lot of readings at the time where that was focused on race, gender, and identity. So this was the first book that really kind of hit me in the face and looked at California history from that perspective. She argues in the book that Euro-American narratives of the Bear Flag Revolt and colonization of the Northern California frontier and the Napa Valley had the effect of erasing the histories and stories of indigenous peoples and Californios who had lived in the valley long before, right, the first American immigrants had arrived. But what bothered me about her book, right, for all of its virtues, again, I don't want to chastise it too much, was her portrayal of Maria Juarez as a quote, unquote, landed Californiana of the racial caste Española, whose presence in colonial Mexican California had the effect of exploiting indigenous women. There was something there that bothered me, right? Especially in light of that essential art book that I had helped Brian work on. Heidenreich's account relies heavily on a memoir written by Vivian Juarez Rose called The Past is Father of the Present. I do have that book here if you'd like to take a look at that later on. And she's another great-granddaughter of Maria and Matthias Cayetano Juarez. However, strangely enough, the memoirs really don't make mention of Maria's indigenous ancestry. It's notably absent. And I don't know if at the time maybe the family wasn't aware of some of those maternal ancestors that linked to Maria because they were kind of hyper-focused on Cayetano's lineage, right? That's a possibility, but I don't know for sure. That's when I realized that Brian had been looking at mission records from Mission Dolores or San Francisco Diocese and the records from Mission Carmel when he had been writing about Maria Juarez's ancestry. So this is where we're going to move on to the next slide. All right, so my intro to this, when I was finishing up my master's degree at Sonoma State University in 2019, I began looking more closely at California mission records for primary source material. Now, those of you who've done research probably know a lot of those original records are housed in the Santa Barbara Mission Archive Library. There's some over at the Huntington Library, the Bancroft, they're kind of spread out. But remarkably, right, I kind of hit the jackpot in the time of my graduation, and that just around that time, the Huntington Library, courtesy of Dr. Stephen Hackle, had made all of these digitized mission records available through a database called the Early California Population Project, ECPP for short. And when I was telling other people, historians, they didn't believe. No, you need to go to the. No, this is a database. You can go and find it. And right, I've been trained a little bit in how to use these types of databases. You can search by keywords and fields. Takes a little bit of familiarity with it. But what I realized, right, is these mission records held key details, beyond birth dates, beyond death dates, beyond baptism dates, about ethnicity, about casta, about where specifically indigenous people, right, had been originally, had lived from before they arrived at the mission. The database documents the lives of over 100,000 individuals from California mission records between 1769 and 1850. And this slide here, I'm showing you the mission record entry for Maria Juarez baptism at Mission Dolores in 1815. Okay. Now, on her mission record, it reads Maria de Jesus Viviana Higuera. Okay. You will see Viviana and Higuera spelled differently depending on the source. Viviana is also translated as Viridiana or Viviana. Higuera, right? Instead of the Y, put the HI in there, right? Now you have Higuera. So you have to kind of understand these nuances when people are documenting, right? What they're hearing, what they're phonetically hearing and writing down. And then kind of put that together with some more modern documents to understand, okay, we're talking about the same individual, because it gets confusing really fast. Just a little side note about Viridiana, which I think is lovely. It's a common Spanish name that was assigned to indigenous women at mission baptisms throughout California between 1769 up until the 1800s. It is of Latin origin. It means green or verdant, of course. It symbolizes growth, vitality, and natural beauty, and it has historical connections to the Roman goddess Venus and the Roman Catholic saint Viridiana, whose feast day is celebrated on February 16th. Now remember that date. That date keeps coming up in the family's history again, and again. Coincidence? I think not. By comparing baptism, marriage, and death records in this ECPP database, I was able to trace Maria's maternal line back to Viridiana Maria, right? And some documents say Maria Viviana, Maria Viridiana, right? She was an indigenous woman who had been baptized on March 15th, 1774 at Mission Carmel. Now, one thing I want to highlight before we move too far, if you look at the key fields here down here, it says egos, ethnicity, and then raison, right? And this, we're getting into this territory here, the Spanish casta system and how classifications of ethnicity and race in mission records were reflective of the fluidity of the Spanish caste system at the time. Were factors such as occupation, your surname, right, which sometimes you adopted from the godparent, Carrillo is an example, or Vallejo, and marriage affected a person's social status from birth and throughout life. For this reason, casta terminology often reflected racial and ethnic composition in a very imprecise and inconsistent way. Notice I'm being very careful in this definition, right, because I realize how politically sensitive when we get in discussions of race things can be. But this is the way the Spanish and in the early Mexican period, this is how they viewed, right, ethnicity and race. Very fluid, right? And it was directly tied to your social status. It was further complicated by this later use of the term raison. So next slide. Here you see some of these casta definitions. And down at the bottom, right, I'm defining raison here. And this is based on a lot of different scholars. I particularly like a piece written by Vladimir Guerrero called Case, Race, and Class in Spanish California. I kind of borrowed some of his language there when I was defining the Spanish case system. But if you go down here, I'm going to read that directly. So raison is a term originally applied to Indians, right? Neophyte natives, newly baptized Indians, who through baptism and acculturation have become part of colonial society. But very quickly, especially after 1821, the term razón, which literally translated from Spanish to English means reason, right? If you were a Native person, when you first came into a mission, you were a gente de sin razón, person without reason, right? Once you were baptized and acculturated and have seemed to be converted to the Catholic religion, you eventually were seen as a gente con razón, person with reason, right? An enlightened person. That's the way that the Spanish padres viewed, right, this kind of philosophy behind conversion to the Catholic faith. But after 1821, eventually, razón came to distinguish Europeans and mixed race individuals, where the use of reason, a prerequisite to citizenship, okay, was considered inherent in adulthood or at birth because of the parents, keyword parents, Spanish ethnicity. Okay, so herein lies this kind of, I want to call it loophole, this opportunity, an advantage to a Native woman who's looking maybe to get a ticket out of the missions, to get a ticket out of this very oppressive, right? We know from prior readings, very violent, oftentimes, system into a situation, a social environment where she can protect herself better and offer better access to privileges and things for her children. Next slide. Okay, so this is where we're going to get into this letter here. Mission records indicate that Viridiana Maria Cassette was married at Mission Carmel, 1786, to a man named Juan Manuel Marcos Villa. Sorry, I apologize for mispronouncing that. From now on, I'm going to call him Marcos. Marcos was born in Sonora, Mexico in 1742. He was one of 3 solteros, single bachelors, among the soldados de cuera, leather jacket soldiers, that arrived in California as part of the famous 1775 Anza expedition. He is also listed as one of the 15 men in the original group of settlers for the Pueblo, San Jose. And if you look even further at the 1790 census, his casta is listed as Coyote. Okay? Coyote was another one of those casta terminologies which defined somebody who was of 1/4 Spanish and 3/4 Indigenous descent, right? And he was Indigenous Baja Indian descent. The records indicate that at the time of Marcos's marriage to Viridiana, she was only 12 years of age, and he was 36. They were married for 19 years and had 7 children together. And all the daughters, including Maria Juarez's mother, Maria Teresa, all of them were daughters, rather, including Maria Juarez's mother. And her full name was Maria Teresa de Jesus Villela. After Marcos passed away, Viridiana married a second mestizo soldier by the name of Francisco Marcelo Barcena and Mission Dolores. They had 3 children together, 1 daughter and 2 sons, and Francisco passed away in 1814. Viridiana continued living in San Francisco until her passing on February 15th, 1830. One day later, on February 16th, remember the date, the feast day of St. Viridiana, she was buried in the cemetery at Mission Dolores. Now, at the same time, I was looking at the mission records online. I began researching documents within the collection of the Santa Barbara Mission Archive Library. And I reached out to a scholar named Dr. Damian Basic, professor of Spanish and Ibero-American Studies at San Jose State University, to help me transcribe and translate one particular document that had caught my eye. That document number will forever infamously known as CMD 23. You can look it up in their finding aid. And here is a picture of the first page, dated to 1786. And it is entitled The Matrimonial Investigation Concerning Marcos Villela, Soldier, and Maria Bibiana, aka Viridiana Maria, Mission Indian. As a side note, I would like to say that matrimonial investigations were a requirement in Alta California. for marriages between Spanish Mexican soldiers or naturalized Mexican citizens of non-Spanish ancestry with an indigenous woman. Okay, so it was just, you couldn't have this type of intermarriage without this document being produced. The investigations typically took place after the betrothal ceremony. And like I said, it documented legal permission from the Spanish Mexican government and or the church courts over such unions. Essentially, CMD 23 it's kind of like a chain letter to Pedro Fages, who was then the first lieutenant governor of the province of the Californios, from Padre Fermin Lasuen and Vincent Briones. And I've circled this name there for a reason, but I'll get to that in a minute. And here is an excerpt from that letter. I'm going to read it real quick. I don't want to bore you too much. Remember, this is like 17th, 18th century Spanish, language here. Very, very regal. Before me, Friar Fermin Francisco de Lasuen of the Order of Our Father San Francisco de Asís is Marcos Veleda, soldier of this company, originally from Real de Tehuacache. This is a province in Sonora, Mexico. About 36 years of age, son of Francisco Javier and Pascua Jacinta, presented himself for the purpose of marriage, that of his free and spontaneous will he wishes to marry Viridiana Maria, a neophyte of the mission, daughter of Joseph Cristobal Carrillo, remember that name, this is important, and Delfina de Jesus, Indians of the mission and the rancheria. Now, the reason I've circled Vincent Briones at the bottom, and maybe Briones rings a bell, is perhaps you're familiar with the story of, next slide, this woman, Juana Briones de Miranda, a Californio ranchera, medical practitioner, and for all intents and purposes is remembered as one of the she's the founding mother of Yerba Buena, right, of San Francisco. Vicente was Juana's grandfather, and at the time he signed the witness document to Marcos and Viridiana's union, Vicente himself was married to a Chumash woman named Mariana. Now remember, that's her baptized name. A lot of times mission records do not reflect the indigenous names of these people. They're only writing down the Spanish or Christianized names. And he was stationed at the Presidio in Monterey. His casta in 1790 is listed as mulatto, right? Half Spanish and half African ancestry. Other mixed casta soldiers from Monterey Presidio were also witness to Marcos and Viridiana's marriage. You can read about them in my article. I'm not going to go into detail on that. This is all just to illustrate to you, right, an argument that scholars Dr. Rosemary Beebe and Dr. Robert Sankwitz have been making for a very long time, and people need to listen to this, that in the normal day-to-day workings of any missionaries and lower-ranking corporals and soldiers, especially those from mixed ancestries, right, mestizo, mulatto, indio, Africano, Afro, shared a relationship that was much more cooperative than confrontational, right? Because I know you read and hear a lot about the Spanish soldiers and the tensions between the missionaries and some of the violence that happened as a result. Now, this letter, right, continues to state that Viridiana's parents, Joseph Cristobal Carrillo, go ahead and move on to the next slide, and Delfina de Jesus were from the indigenous rancheria of Achasta. If I had a pointer, which I don't, so I'm just going to come up here and point. That's right about in that area. There's Achasta. It's one of the 5 important rancherias of the Ramzan Ohlone tribal district that comprises the lower Carmel River Valley. Right? These are Costanoan, Ohlone, and Esalen speaking peoples. It's very important to understand how the people today want to be referred to, right? Because of tribal trust status, collective nation groups, right? It's very important to have a clear understanding of that. Other rancherias in the district, right, included villages such as Tacotna, Echalat, Ixchenta, and Sucaronda. And all of this, right, is years, generations of anthropological and historical archaeological studies have produced this body of findings for these villages. Atchasa is also significant because it was the nearest permanent indigenous ranchera to the Presidio of Monterey. The indigenous peoples, Rums and Ohlone peoples of this district were among the first that Father Serra and the Spanish soldiers from the Portola expedition would have encountered in the early 1770s. When you hear about these acts of violence towards women, a lot of them were committed by these soldiers, these early Catalan, pure-blooded Spanish soldiers in these early expeditions. So much so, if you move to the next slide, that in 1773, in order to kind of curb this violence, check the rapid spread of disease, gain native trust, right? And kind of diffuse tensions. He proposed at the time to the Viceroy, Bucareli, that there be an intermarriage program between more respectable soldiers, right? Can you guys send some soldiers here who aren't going to be attacking the women and right, more family oriented? And as an incentive, right, they're going to get land, access to women's communities labor. They'll be excused from military duty. They get a seaman salary for 2 years, right? Lots of incentives there. And for a while, it sort of worked, was mildly successful. It's primarily why intermarriage between Spanish Mexican soldiers and indigenous women accounted for some 37% of all the marriages contracted in the Monterey area between 1773 and 1790. And this image on the right here is a depiction of what may be an Esalen woman who was drawn in 1791 by an artist named Jose Cardero, courtesy of the Monterey archives down there. Now, Viridiana's father, remember I told you to remember the name Carrillo. Viridiana's father, Cristobal Jose, and Viridiana herself had been sponsored in their baptisms by a soldier named Guillermo Carrillo through the process of campandrasco. Campandrasco, right, is that Spanish tradition of godparentage, right? You have a comadre, a compadre, a godmother, godfather, who bear witness to the conversion ceremony and the mission. And Guillermo is a distant cousin of the famed ranchera, move on, Maria Carrillo. This image of her has not been 100% confirmed. There's some debate on whether or not that's really her. I think it is. She's the founder of Santa Rosa and mother of Francisca Benicia Carrillo Vallejo, otherwise known as Doña Francisca Vallejo, the wife of General Vallejo. And Guillermo arrived in Alta California in 1769. He's a cousin of Maria's. He was part of the Portola expedition, a Catalan volunteer, but not one of these men, thankfully, that was prone to violence towards women. In fact, he actually, the mission record shows that he sponsored quite a few Native women and men throughout the early mission period, including Viridiana's father, right? Now, next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit now. We're going to get into casta, right, and ethnicity, because this is where things can get kind of complicated, but it's really important to the story. Marcos and Viridiana's fourth daughter was Maria Teresa de Jesus Villela, born February 11th, 1796. Now, when she was baptized on the same day at Mission Carmel, she was classified as mestiza. So that's the Carrillo lineage. So you can see, just for comparison, Maria Feliciana Abayo was Maria Carrillo's mother. Her costume was mulata libre. And then by the time Maria was born, because her mother had married a Spanish soldier, she had now become Razon, sometimes mulata, but for all intents and purposes, Razon. And then Benicia, right, she practically erased any of her roots, to mulatto ancestry. She's just listed as Razon. So when you go to the next slide, right, now you can kind of see how I kind of adopted that same kind of, analogy, if you will, to the maternal line for Viridiana, all the way up to Maria Juarez. So Marcos and Viridiana's fourth daughter was Maria Teresa de Jesus Villela, born February 11th, classified as mestiza. In June of 1812, Maria Teresa de Jesus Now, by this time, had been recasted as raison. Remember what raison means, right? A person of high status, person of reason. We're erasing any of that mixed indigenous ancestry, and right, we're just calling you that European person of reason. Was married to Francisca Javier Higuera, right? It appears that this union to a soldier, like I said, completely erased Maria Teresa's mestiza status or indigenous ancestry. They had 8 children, 3 daughters, 5 sons. Their second child was Maria de Jesus Viviana Higuera Juarez. She was born December 1st, 1815, according to mission records. I realize there's some discrepancy between different sources on that. When Maria was only 15 years old, around 1830, she lost not just her father to sea, because he was a sea merchant and the whaling ship just disappeared. They don't know what happened to it. But she also lost her grandmother, her full-blooded Ramzan Ohlone grandmother. 1830 was not a happy time for Maria. She was only 15. One of the reasons I believe in the memoir, Father Past and Present, where Viviana says that Maria is pretty silent on this time period. She's in mourning. She's in deep mourning, right? She's lost her father and she's lost her grandmother, who both had really important, right, roles to play in her life. Now, Maria's mother passed away in February 1835. And again, when was she buried? We think around February 16th, 1835. According to mission records, Maria de Jesus Higuera married Cayetano Juarez at Mission San Rafael, not at Mission Dolores. Okay, there's a difference in some of the other sources. On February 16th, 1836. Other accounts say Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1835. That can't be possible because Maria was in mourning over her mother's passing in 1835. Okay, so, and again, February 16th, feast day of Meridiana. There's a theme, right? That's why it's important. That date is especially important to them. And it all goes back to, right, the Ramzan Ohlone grandmother. They were married by Father Quijas, a Zacatecan padre who was serving as a parish priest both at Mission San Rafael and Mission San Francisco Solano at the time. And they were living within the pueblo of Sonoma, where Cayetano was stationed as a soldier of the Sonoma Barracks garrison, under the authority of his childhood friend, Mariano Vallejo. Okay. Next slide. So here you see, right, thank you, Napa County Historical Society, for these wonderful images of both Maria and Cayetano. As I mentioned, Cayetano was stationed at the barracks, but I believe from other research that he was working as a guard at the mission as far back as 1827. I have documents that prove that. And he later on documented a testimonial. Now, I don't have time to give you that testimony in full. I think that will be the subject of a different article that I would like to write. Again, with Damian Bostich's help, it's been transcribed and translated for the first time, anytime. No other scholar has taken a look at Juarez's testimonial. But essentially, he told Henry Cerruti in 1875 that before the whites came to Sonoma, the Indians possessed boundless lands, large number of antelope, deer, ducks, talks about all the wildlife. He talks a lot about the silkroot plant amole. Really detailed memories that I argue, right, most soldiers wouldn't care about these kind of details with indigenous people, but because his wife, right, had this indigenous background, I believe that's why, right, he shared these kind of details and memories. Because again, he knew it was important to her. She refused to give a testimonial in 1875. She was so upset with the events that happened with Captain C. Fremont, Bear Flag Revolt in 1846. She said, no, thank you, I'm not going to talk to her. Now, throughout Cayetano's military service in Sonoma, Maria developed intimate connections with the local host Miwok. She learned, next slide, she learned the skills of a curandera, or a traditional healer, from both her mother and grandmother. Again, this is documented in multiple places. Vivian Juarez memoirs, mission records, and then her own husband in his testimonial. She kept written notes regarding the medicinal uses of plants, including stinging nettle and wild plantain leaves that are very consistent. Again, if you go deep into the ethnobotanical scholarship, very consistent with Ramzan Ohlone medicinal healing techniques. In 1837, the indigenous communities of Napa and Sonoma Valley were devastated by what was called the Miramontes smallpox epidemic. Some 40 to 300,000 indigenous people lost their lives from this one epidemic alone, including many of General Vallejo's laborers. Native baskets like this one, dating to the approximate time of the epidemic, suggest that local indigenous peoples were offering these baskets as gifts or payment in exchange for Maria's care. Okay, so again, this is one of those baskets that belonged to Dolores Unger, which was passed down through the family lineage. And Brian studied it, and he could tell, right? These basket scholars are amazing. Brian Bibby, Ralph Shanks, they spend enough time like counting the stitches, looking at the weave, the coil. They can tell from the beadwork, the types of feathers used, who made it, when, and where. It's that precise. And it's really, it's a skill that you develop over time. Among the things that are on here are red feathers from acorn woodpeckers and green feathers from mallet duck, white glass beads, and some evidence of valley quail toplets. Clearly, this is a gift basket. He's not confident enough to label the tribal origin, right? Because there are multiple tribes who are part of the mission community in San Francisco Solano who could have made baskets like this, right? Had the skills to do that. Now, from 1836 to 1845, Cayetano served as a captain in Vallejo's barracks militia and engaged in a number of military expeditions with Vallejo's brother Salvador against local indigenous groups. I'm not going to get into that. That's a dark chapter. As a reward for his service, Vallejo granted Cayetano a series of land claims, including, next slide, the 8,865-acre Rancho Tulucay, where in 1845 Juarez built his second adobe family home near the area marked Sospo. Now, sorry for the academic sounding sentence, but it's important to understand it from this perspective. Juarez Rancho Tulucay was a complex settler colonial space, right, that overlapped multiple indigenous tribal, right, claims to the territory, right? I talk about the Wapo, I talk about the Patwa. There were even some Coast Miwok, right, who were arguing at the time this is some of our territory. But at the same time, within the space, right, they were employing a diversity of indigenous peoples to assist in the maintenance of it. So this becomes a very mixed, right, ethnically diverse space. But specifically, Maria developed a very unique relationship with the people of the Patwin-speaking Rancheria Tuluca. Now, sometimes Tuluca in the literature is spelled or pronounced Tulucay, Tulucay, Tulcay, Tulucal. We know that Father Altamira encountered the Patwin people of Tulucal in 1823 when he sent an expedition through the Napa Valley looking for that mission site, which eventually became Mission San Francisco Solano. So it was here in 1823. Now, whether or not, right, it had been here for 500,000 years, it's hard to tell. My suspicion is because of all the disruption, colonial disruption by the Spanish in building the missions along the coastline, and because they were further sending expeditions further inland to capture fugitives, right, runaways from the mission, that they displaced people in the Sassoon area, think Chief Solano, think some of his tribal heritage, and pushed some of these peoples to move to different areas. And so by 1823, this is when Father Altamira is encountering these people. Now, Heidenreich defines Maria's relationship with the Tuluca as exploitive. And so, see, again, this is where I take issue with her book. Because I argue because of her indigenous ancestry is much more nuanced than that, right? It's much more complicated. True, Native women worked under Maria as domestic servants and caretakers, but like Maria Carrillo, and remember, because of the earlier slide I was showing you that Carrillo was a sponsor, right, a godparent to Viridiana Maria, Maria Juarez, in a way, has spiritual kinship to Maria Carrillo. Now, whether or not they were aware of that in like 1830s and 1840s, I'm not sure. But Damien speculates that they were. But like Maria Carrillo, the ranchera of the Santa Rosa Rancho, Maria learned how to speak local native dialects, and she worked alongside indigenous women in the field to gather traditional native plants for food, medicine, and other uses. In addition, oral histories and gift baskets suggest that Maria and her daughters bonded with Native women over the birth of children. So we're talking about, right? It's not kinship by blood, but it's deeper than that, right? It's a cross between a spiritual kinship and just right that familial kinship that comes with being part of somebody's life, right, from birth till death. 4 baskets donated to the Phoebe Hearst Museum by Vivian Juarez Rose in the 1970s were collected by the Juarez family in Napa County between 1840 and 1860. Move on to the next slide, please. And this is one of them. The form, style, and technique of these baskets, like the cone basket I showed you earlier, and then this one, are consistent with traditional Patwin gift baskets. Okay. According to Rose's family memoirs, one of these baskets, nicknamed the Napa Indian basket, okay, that's the label it got, and that's the label that it is in the Phoebe Hearst Museum, was given to Maria by an Indian woman named Juanita sometime in the 1840s. We don't know who exactly Juanita was. Obviously, it's a Spanish name that was given to her. Her name does not show up in the Mission San Francisco Sonoma records. I already went down that path, that rabbit hole where she's still a mystery to us, right? But with the help of basket scholar Ralph Shanks in 2016, I was able to track down this basket to an offsite warehouse that's used by the Phoebe Hearst Museum for their collections. They have a huge basket collection. The moment they brought this basket out, we were like, it's just like chills, goosebumps, because this basket hadn't been out of storage since 1974 or thereabouts when Dolores Unger Juarez had donated it to the Phoebe Hearst Museum, right? And we knew right away, well, Ralph knew right away. I was still trying to get a little more familiarized with Patwin styles of basketry at the time. But he understood right away what he was looking at. But then because I had done the research here, thank you very much, Napa County Historical Archives. Yes, I knew that was going to come up here. So dimension-wise, her sewing basket was 12 inches by 4.5 inches. At one time, the basket was lined with silk. On the outside, it was lined with beads and quail feathers. And then Ralph said later on, he thought that in addition to quail feathers, there were probably the red woodpecker feathers, the acorn woodpecker scalps. Again, this is a gifts basket. This isn't any old basket that you would just hand off. And yes, there was a trade and exchange of baskets by Native women at the time for goods, right? There was a barter system, especially when times, they're just trying to feed their kids. And it's like, what do you have left? Okay, we're going to have to start handing off our family heirlooms. That's a very sad part of that history. But I argue with these gift baskets that it shows a deeper connection and a kinship with Maria and her family and her children that goes beyond just, here's a basket, can I have some food, right? That type of relationship. And next slide. Thankfully, based on my research and Ralph showing up there to kind of back me up, didn't have my MA by 2016, so right, we're kind of looking at me suspicious. Who's this graduate student pretending like she knows stuff? They updated their entry record in their database, and they put a copy of the basket photographs that were in the memoirs and then updated. You know, previously they had it identified as Pomo and Wapo, and Ralph's like, no, this isn't Pomo or Wapo, this is Powin, right? And so that's the story behind that. So, like I started in the beginning of my presentation tonight, I started with a basket and I'm ending with a basket. Because I see these baskets as a tangible and symbolic representation of Maria's deep connections with the indigenous communities of California. They are connections that I believe Maria was very in tune with throughout her life, in a way that mere social status attained through intermarriage with a Californio soldier like Cayetano, or life in a militarized Mexican colonial society did not interfere with, right? She was a woman of two worlds and she kept that identity throughout her life, regardless of what the mission record said, right? Zone or Espanol or whatever. And like her Rumsey Aloni grandmother, Verdiana, Maria Juarez understood in a literal and figurative sense that she was an hija del país, a native daughter of the land. Next slide. I want to thank you very much for coming tonight. These are some recommended readings. A lot of these scholars' inspiration for my work and research over the last 10 years. I particularly like Erica Perez's Colonial Intimacies, Interactive Kinship, Sexuality, and Marriage in Southern California. And of course, there's Linda Heidenreich's book. But yeah, any one of these books, very, very good, summary and analysis and scholarship on Californian and women's history in the Spanish and Mexican period in California. And then the next slide. I wish to acknowledge, in addition to the Napa County Historical Society, all these other organizations that without them, right, this is what ethnohistorians do. We have to partner and work with different institutions in multiple environments, archives, archaeology, basketry, museums, right, to put these pieces together and tell a more complete story, especially when it comes to indigenous histories of California. And these are all the institutions and the individuals. I'd also like to thank, I didn't mention her name, so Deborah Lee, who is the interpretive one at Sonoma State Historic Park, and she's the one that got Caitlin and I connected last year. She's last year sponsored for the first time the Women's History Crawl at our park, and we're going to repeat it again in spring of 2026, so be on the lookout for that. Without her, I would not have been able to talk to you tonight. So